Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and this is the tips and tricks tutorial for Bling Bag. Bling Bag was July 2024's Lola's Choice kit. Lola's Choice is my small knitted kit club, and you are welcome to join us anytime. In a nutshell, Bling Bag is a sack for your yarn balls. I've got lots to tell you about Bling Bag. I really love this design. This stylish design uses fingering weight recycled denim yarn held double throughout. You can also make it with one strand of DK weight yarn. Bling Bag's bottom, say that 5 times fast, can be knit or crochet. That's crafter's choice. The crochet bottom has more structure than the knit version, so keep this in mind when deciding. The body of Bling Bag features pre-strung beads throughout it. The casing at the top employs a new technique, Lola's 2-timing technique, a fresh way to use stitch saver that creates a double layer of fabric. The bag is finished with an I-cord drawstring and an optional Peyote stitch slide bead to cinch your bag up. You're going to need to have the pattern to follow along with this tutorial. I'll give you the link to that below, along with anything else, any other like videos or tips or tricks I refer to in this video. So look below for links. We'll also timestamp all of the chapters in this tutorial. So if you look below, you can click ahead and watch the part of the pattern that you're at as you're doing that, instead of watching the whole tutorial before you get going with the pattern. That is completely up to you. So the first thing that I'm going to do is jump right in with materials so you know what you need to gather along with your kit if you're working with one to have success knitting Bling Bag. Let's talk about materials for your Bling Bag. You can either work with 2 strands of fingering weight yarn held together or 1 strand of DK. If you're going to work with beads, then you definitely want to work with 2 strands of fingering weight because the beads will not fit on your DK weight yarn. If you're working with a kit, let's go over what's in that kit together. First, you're going to get 2 balls of Kremke Soul Will Reborn Denim Uni. This is a recycled cotton yarn, and you're getting 2 balls because every sack needs 2 balls, right? The other thing that's in your kit are some size 6 beads. These are size 6 Japanese seed beads. These beads are made by Toho. You also have a dental floss threader for stringing those beads onto your yarn. You also have materials for making the optional Peyote stitch bead. What you have there is a Japanese beading needle and then some fire line for making that Peyote stitch bead, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this video. The other thing that you'll need is some stitch saver. I just had to go grab that. You'll need a length of stitch saver, at least like 30 inches of stitch saver. I'll give you a blog post if you don't know anything about stitch saver. This is a 2mm hollow silicone tubing, and this will be used for the Lola's 2-timing technique. I am so excited to teach you how to do that. So that's kind of everything that's in your kit. Other things that you're going to need are needles and a crochet hook if you're going to work the crochet hook, and let's go over all of that stuff together. So the first thing, if you're looking at the pattern, you will see that it calls for 2 different size needles, needle B and needle A. I decided to make it easier and call needle B the bigger needle and needle A the smaller needle. Needle A is used for the bottom of the bag and then for the inside of the casing, and needle B is used for the outside of the bag and the top of the bag. If you are doing the knit bottom, then you're going to also need some double pointed needles. Those are the same size as needle A. And if you are doing the crochet bottom, then you're going to need a crochet hook. I used, I believe, what did I use? A 4mm crochet hook, which is a size G crochet hook for doing the crochet bottom of the bag. Other things that you're going to need is a pile of stitch markers. You'll want to make sure that at least one of those stitch markers is a removable stitch marker. Just grab ones that you love. Sometimes I like to make one of the stitch markers different than all the rest of the stitch markers so that you know where you are at the beginning of the round. And then finally, when it's time to do that I-cord, at the end, sorry, I lost my words for a second, the I-cord strap at the end of your bling bag, you can either use an I-cord tool or use double pointed needles for making that I-cord strap. And at the very end, when you go to block, you might want to use a little bit of fabric fusion on the ends of your cotton yarn so it doesn't worm out. If you're working with a wool yarn, you don't have to worry about that so much, but I'll talk about this a little bit when we get to finishing. So those are pretty much the materials. And once we've talked about that, I quickly want to talk about gauge, and then we'll get into some techniques that I think you're going to find really useful for knitting your bling bag. Okay, I know this is just a bag, but we have to talk about gauge. We always have to talk about gauge. One of the reasons we have to talk about gauge is that if you're working with a kit, you don't want to run out of yarn, and you also want to get the most out of your yarn. So I give you gauge in the pattern blocked on needle B, which is the needle that you're using for the outside of your fabric. The gauge blocked is 21 stitches over 30 rounds. And I give you that gauge because bling bag is worked in the round, so you need a gauge worked in the round. I do have a really handy trick for working a gauge swatch in the round, and I'll link to that below if you haven't worked that in one of my past patterns. It's a really interesting technique for working gauge in the round but flat. I think you're really going to enjoy it, so check that out if you haven't watched it yet. And then I also give you gauge for the crochet bottom in the round. That's about 20 chains by 16 rounds equals 4 inches for single crochet. So if you have any questions about gauge, if you haven't worked gauge before, or you're not sure if you've gotten the correct gauge, we will have Ravelry threads and a Facebook thread for Bling Bag. Go ahead and ask there, ask below this video, and we'll get you going with gauge. So one other thing I always like to say, if you are working from a kit, I always design kits so you have at least 15%, or I, when I'm designing, have 15% of my yarn left over. So don't worry about it if you use up a little bit of your yarn for doing your gauge swatch. Just lay that aside so that if you run short at the end of your bag, you can go over to those gauge swatches or gauge swatch to use that yarn. You can just leave it aside and come back to it if you need it. But I always give a little bit extra for just in case. So now that you know that, it is time to jump in and talk about the bottoms, the knit bottom and then the crochet bottom, because you're going to have to decide which one you want to make. So to get going with Bling Bag, you have to decide if you're going to work a knit bottom or a crochet bottom. I know some of you are not interested in being hookers and doing any crochet. Some of you have been learning how to crochet lately. Some of you were crocheters before you were knitters. The big difference in Bling Bag is the knit bottom has a little bit less structure than the crochet bottom. For both of them, the yarn is held double if you are working with the fingering weight yarn. The knit bottom is worked from the center out, just like if you were working the top of the hat. You start with a circular cast on and work in the round with increases every other round. It's very, very easy. If you are working the crochet bottom, like on this bag right here, the crochet bottom is worked with single crochet around. You start with an invisible cast on, an invisible ring cast on, I think, or a magic ring cast on. It has a few different names. It's the one that's used in amigurumi a lot. And you start with that and work around, and I'll show you a few tips and tricks to get you going that help me. I'm not an incredibly strong crocheter, but I really love to crochet, and I've been learning more and more to get my crochet to look a little bit better. So those are the two choices for the bottom. I'll show you a few tips and tricks for working the bottom of the knit, and then we'll move on to the crochet bottom next. Okay, we're getting going with the knit bottom. The knit bottom starts with a circular cast on, and you'll be casting on 6 stitches. I do have a really great video for how to work the circular cast on. It includes tips and tricks if you are challenged by it all, and I will link to that below for anybody who hasn't worked this cast on before or wants a refresher. I'm just going to show you very quickly under the camera for those of you that just want to see it one more time. The first thing that you do when you are making a circular cast on is to make a knot just like that, and then hold that knot with the yarn hanging down, and then have your working yarn going over your index finger. It does not matter if you hold your yarn in your right hand or your left hand, it is worked exactly the same. And then you take your needle, go underneath your working yarn, and then go inside the ring and grab your yarn. And now you have 2 stitches on your needle. You make a yarn over, you dive inside, you make a yarn over, you dive inside. And now you can see I have 6 stitches on my needles, and then I can pull that tail tight, slide those stitches to the other end of my needle, and knit 1 row, and that will build that circular cast on. Once you have knit to the end of this row, the next thing that you're going to do is separate your stitches onto 3 needles so that you have 2 stitches on 3 needles, and then you will begin to work in the round. Again, if this is a new cast on to you, definitely go ahead and watch that video that I link below. I really go into it in detail, and it would make this video way too long for me to go over all of that again. What this is going to look like once you have worked the knit into the front and back. Let me just kind of get this set up under the camera for you so that you can see it. All right, what this is going to look like on your needles. I have worked the knit into the front and the back, so I have 12 stitches on my needles. And you will see right now, because I'm on double pointed needles, I'm not placing a marker in between every 2 stitches as the pattern says, because the marker would just fall right off my double pointed needle. So instead, on the first needle, I've placed a fun stitch marker, and then in between those sections on the second needle and the third needle, I've placed just a plain stitch marker to separate so you know where to work your increases. That fun stitch marker that you have on the first needle lets you know that you're back to the beginning of the round. So that's a really easy trick when you're working in the round on double pointed needles to make sure you know where the start of your round is. Another thing that you can do is take a removable stitch marker and place it towards the beginning of the round, again, because markers just will go flying off the end of a double pointed needle. Now, once you have enough stitches on your needles as you work those increased rounds and you're ready to switch over to the 16-inch circular needle, at that point you're going to want to place markers in between every section so you know where those increase points are as the bottom of your bag is building out. And again, just used a fun stitch marker for the first stitch marker of the round, or a different stitch marker. It doesn't have to be fun, so that you know when you're back to the beginning of the round. The bottom of the bag is worked with needle A, and when you finish the bottom of the bag and you're switching over to work the body of the bag, you will switch over to needle B. So those are kind of my tips and tricks for working the knit bottom. Now let's look at that crochet bottom. I think it's going to be really fun to kind of jump into a little bit of crochet together. Okay, let's work on the crochet bottom together. The crochet bottom starts with a magic loop. As I said at the beginning, I am not a very strong crocheter, but I do really love to crochet. So I have been learning and getting more confident, particularly with my magic loop. I have always had to, in the past, go ahead and watch a video right before I work the magic loop. I've finally gotten it down, so I don't need to watch a video to show you how to do this, but I'll link below go to my favorite tutorial for working this. It has both a photo tutorial and a video tutorial, and it just really breaks it down step by step if you need that kind of support as you're doing it. Let's just start right away with round 1, which has you casting on 8 stitches with the magic loop cast on, and then we'll go ahead with round 2 together. So what I'm going to do now is lay my yarn over my palm. This is my right hand is holding the tail and my left hand is laying flat right there. And so my working yarn is over here. I'm laying my yarn over my palm. I'm wrapping it around my pinky. I'm coming behind the rest of my fingers, bringing that tail up over my index finger, and then crossing over the top right there. And then once I do that, I'm pinching with my thumb to hold onto that magic loop. And then I'm taking my crochet hook and I'm going into the loop, and I am grabbing my yarn with my crochet hook. A little bit of tension really helps right there, and pulling that yarn through. And then I'm grabbing my yarn again and pulling it through one more time. And that does not count as a chain. That's just setting myself up. And now I am going to go ahead and work 8 single crochets into this circle. So I'm going to go into the circle and I'm going to grab my yarn, and then I'm going to yarn over the hook, and I'm going to pull that through. The mistake I make sometimes when I'm doing this is I don't work it quite loosely enough, and then it's really hard to get into the chains of the first round. So I'm trying to remind myself to do this loosely. Now I'm going to go in, grab the yarn, wrap it around. That's 2. That's 3. That's 4. That's 5. 6. 7. And 8. Beautiful. Now, we had a little debate on Instagram the other day whether you pull up your little magic loop right here right away, or if you wait until you've worked a few rounds. I always like to pull up a little bit just to make sure that I did it correctly, because if you don't work it correctly and it won't pull up, then you're going to end up having to rip out and start again. So I always just kind of check it. And now I am ready to work that first round 2, which has me single crocheting 2 stitches into the first chain. And if you are unsure where that first chain is, what you can do is count back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so this is my first chain right here. And I am going to double crochet into that. Sometimes it takes me a second. Remember I said if you work it too tightly, it's hard to get your crochet hook in there. So I'm just kind of opening it up a little bit so I can get her in there without splitting my yarn. There we go. And now I am going to single crochet twice into that first chain right there. So I'm single crocheting twice. And now, most importantly, before I continue on, I am going to grab a removable stitch marker and mark that first chain, that first single crochet of those 2 single crochets. And that is because that marks the beginning of the round. And whenever I don't do that, I get very confused about where the beginning of the round is for me. So I always mark that. And now I'm going to continue around, single crocheting 2 single crochets into every chain around the circle. And now, because this is a cooking show, let me show you what that looks like when you're done doing that. Okay, I'm back to the start of the round. I have single crocheted 2 single crochets into every chain, and now I am ready to work round 3, which has me single crocheting 2 single crochets into the first stitch and then 1 single crochet into the next stitch. So what I'm going to do is remove that end of round marker, I am going to single crochet 2 into that chain, and then before I forget, I'm going to replace that end of round marker, and now I'm going to single crochet 1 into the next chain, and then 2 into the next chain, and then you're just going to continue following the pattern until you have a total of, let's look at my pattern. You're continuing until you have a total of 88 stitches going around. So follow the pattern as written, and once you get to 88 stitches, then you are going to slip stitch around, and I want to show you how to slip stitch. Okay, let's look at that slip stitch together. I am back at the beginning of the round. Clearly this is less than 88 stitches because it shows you what we're talking about here. I am going to slip stitch by going into the chain, grabbing the yarn, and pulling it through the loop. So a slip stitch is a little bit different than a single crochet, as you're not working that extra yarn over your hook. And then after I work that first slip stitch, I'm going to place the marker right there so I know where the beginning of the round is. And now I am going to continue slip stitching around. The reason that you are slip stitching around is that then you're going to be picking up stitches along that slip stitch for working of the bottom of the bag with your knitting needle. So that's my slip stitch going around, and let's look at picking up those stitches because that might be something that you haven't done before. Okay, now it is time to pick up the stitches with your knitting needle. I'm just working with the double pointed needle right now. You're going to be using needle B, that 16-inch circular needle B. I'm going to remove the stitch marker right now. You'll place that once you get all of your stitches onto your needle, and then just go ahead and put that last loop onto your needle. Now what you're going to do is go underneath both chains right there, wrap your yarn around and pull it through. If this is challenging, it definitely helps to use a needle that has a nice sharp tip. If you find that it's challenging, or your yarn is splitting, or you're not grabbing both strands if you're working with that fingering weight yarn, I've been trying to have one that's difficult so I could show you this. One thing that you can do is actually use your crochet hook to go underneath. Let me get that needle out of the way. Use your crochet hook to go underneath both those loops of the chain, grab your yarn, pull it through, and then take that loop and put it onto your needle. So that is a way of picking up a stitch and maybe not having it be as challenging as using your knitting needle. It's really a sharp tip on your knitting needle that makes doing that more easier, I was about to say. So you're going to continue all the way around, picking up stitches on the bottom of the bag, and then you are ready to start working in the round. There is a stitch increase to get you up to the correct number of stitches for working the beading patterns, which is a phenomenal segue to say that we are going to talk about beading next. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. Once you have worked the bottom of your bling bag, you are headed into the body. The body has 2 different techniques for working with beads in it. I blame that on my alter ego Lola. She must have gotten a little bored and wanted to play with 2 different techniques. This bag is, like, surprisingly, for a simple bag, chock full of different techniques, which I think is really fun. I clearly get bored and like to play a little bit. So the 2 different beading techniques, one is slipping a bead in front of a stitch and the other is knitting a stitch with a bead. The slipping a bead in front of stitch is a technique I haven't done in a little while, and that's what makes this really fun little wave at the bottom of the bag down there. And then the knitting a stitch with a bead is what makes the fabric kind of beaded all over. It's the technique that I use in Bling Tee and Bling Tank and Bead Kerchief. Those of you who've knit my pattern patterns before, it's going to be a very familiar stitch to you. So I'm going to show you how to do these 2 stitches on the world's most adorable tiny little bling bag that I'm working on. I've been telling Max that I'm working on it for his crystals. It's just going to be great. He can wear it around his neck on a little cord. Isn't it adorable? So I'll use this to show you those 2 techniques quickly. What I will tell you is after you work the bottom, if you are working with beads, what you are going to do is cut your yarn and string some beads onto your yarn with the dental floss threader. I do have a separate video below that I will link to if you have never strung beads onto your yarn before. So you'll cut your yarn, string your beads, and then you'll work 2 more rounds before you get into the beading. And the reason for that is the first stitch of the round when you jump into that beaded wave is a beaded stitch. So you wouldn't want to string on your beads right before you start that round, because that bead will end up migrating onto your tail and be completely lost. Ask me how I know that. So right here, if you look underneath the camera with me, I'm going to show you how easy it is to work that slip 1 bead. What I'm going to do is go down my yarn, grab a bead, slide that bead up so that it's touching the right-hand needle, bring both strands of yarn to the front of your work, and then slip the next stitch purlwise, and then bring your yarn to the back of your work. And then you can see that that bead right there is sitting right in front of the stitch. What you want to make sure is if you end up in a situation where what I would call the strand that's naked is kind of more in front of that bead, manipulate things a little bit so that the strand with the bead is in front of that stitch and really popping out. If you look at those beads on the bottom of the bag, you'll see that they're sitting up really beautifully on top of the fabric, and they make this great little wave. I can't believe I haven't done this technique before in a pattern, or if I have, it's been so long I can't even remember which pattern it is. Maybe one of you will remind me. Now I've got my yarn to the back of my work, and I'm going to go ahead and knit the next stitch, and that locks that bead into place. When you are working the beaded wave, you can either work from the chart or the written instructions. Those are on page 2 of the pattern. I believe it is a 10 stitch repeat for working the beaded wave. Super easy to do, and I think you're going to enjoy that. One thing I'd like to say is that the pattern uses size 6 beads. Size 6 beads have about 12 beads to the gram. I believe the pattern uses a total of 303 beads between the beading in the body of the bag and the peyote stitch bead if you choose to make that at the end. So that is the slip 1 bead. The other technique that I use, and I kind of ripped that out to show you this next technique, is how to do the bling stitch, which is a stitch that I have done very often in patterns. I'll give you a link to a video that I made for Bling Tank, which shows this stitch in detail. The only difference with that video is I show the stitch flat and you're working in the round, so you'll always be knitting on the right side of your work. But this is kind of like a 2-row technique, and I'm all set up to show you, sorry, 2 round technique, and I'm all set up to show you that on this little bling bag. So the first thing that I'm going to do that's different than before is I'm going to go into this stitch as if to knit, and then I'm going to go get a bead and I'm going to slide it up, but I'm not going to slide it up all the way to there. I'm going to slide it up so it's on the working yarn that's going to be making the stitch. And now I'm going to wrap that yarn around, and I am going to pull that stitch through so that I have a bead that's sitting up on one strand of that yarn on my needle. And now I'm going to go ahead and continue knitting, and I am working the chart for this stitch. I'm continuing to knit. I think I'm knitting 5 right now. I am working to the end of the round, and then when I get to the first stitch of the next round, you're going to see that I have a bead on that stitch, and your pattern will say to either have your bead to the front of your needle or bead to the back of the needle. If the bead is to the back of the needle, when I go in to work that stitch, that bead is going to end up on the left leg of the stitch. If I have the bead to the front of the needle, you'll manipulate that bead all the way to the front right there. You're going to knit over it, and then your bead is on the right leg of the stitch. So the pattern is written to tell you bead to the front or bead to the back so that that bead lands either on the right leg or the left leg. You can follow those directions if you want. I couldn't bring myself to not follow them and have this kind of random beading where the beads really look like they're all landing in different spots. Or you can just go ahead and let the beads land wherever they do. It will still come out looking perfectly random. So don't worry too much about it. If that piece of the puzzle feels a little bit finicky to you, just go ahead and knit around. The other piece that I want to say is you do not need to knit bling bag with beads. And in fact, if you're working with DK weight yarn, your beads will not fit on your yarn, so you probably won't be working with beads. If you don't work with beads, you're just going to knit from the bottom up until it is time to work the casing, and then work the casing with Lola's 2-timing technique, which I am so excited to say is the next thing that we're going to do in this video. Okay, I'm very excited to teach you this technique. Right now, I am calling it Lola's 2-timing technique, and it is how I create 2 layers of fabric for the casing. I use a piece of Stitch Saver, and basically what was happening is I knew that I wanted to have a casing in the sack, and in the past, either I would have picked up stitches on the inside of my fabric to work the inside layer of the 2 layers of the casing, or I would have worked and knit into the front and back of every stitch and then split my stitches and had 2 layers of fabric that way. Both of those ways are kind of janky and not that fun. And one day I was like, what if I could use a piece of Stitch Saver to kind of capture the leg of the stitch that I would pick up so that I could go back and put those onto my needle. So as you work this technique, you're going to be working it with needle B for the outside layer of the fabric. And then you'll be going back and using needle A for the inside of the casing to kind of make that second layer a little bit tighter. I'm going to just show you what it looks like quickly on this little swatch right here. You can see this Stitch Saver running along the back of my fabric, and I've been wrapping my yarn around that Stitch Saver as I work it. And then I'll be able to take this Stitch Saver, put my needle into it, and run that through. And I have some little bling bags that I'm going to show you how to do all of these steps on. So here is a little mini bling bag. This is in some DK weight yarn, and I have a piece of Stitch Saver here to use, and I am going to just give you an idea. I think I've already worked the first stitch right there, so I'm going to back up actually to really show this to you well, so we don't skip any step, especially with a new technique. So the first thing that I'm going to do is knit the first stitch of the round. And then I'm going to take my piece of Stitch Saver and have it running underneath the working yarn right there, and then kind of pull that through so it's a little bit longer. And then I'm going to go ahead and knit the next stitch. I like to bring my working yarn up and over the needle so that the stitch that you're picking up has the right leg to the front and the left leg to the back. And then I'm going to go ahead and knit the next stitch. And then I'm going to wrap my yarn around the Stitch Saver. Those of you will notice that my Stitch Saver end is kind of short right there. If you make your Stitch Saver really, really long, it ends up being more fiddly to get your yarn around it. So as I work this technique, I kind of pull more Stitch Saver out. So I'm just kind of wrapping it around and then knitting the next stitch, wrapping it around, and then knitting the next stitch. So you're gonna follow the rounds for the outside of the casing as written in your pattern. The outside of your casing, as I said before, it's worked on needle B, which is the bigger needle, and it is worked flat. So when you get to the end of the round, you'll be turning your work and purling back in the other direction. The reason it's worked flat is you need a slit for your I-cord to go through. So if you look at the bag right here, just down at the bottom of the casing, the outside of the casing is worked flat. So you have the slit right here for your I-cord, and then the inside is worked in the round. I'm super proud of myself for coming up with this. It took me some fiddling, definitely knit and ripped a few times. I think it woke me up in the middle of the night when it wasn't working and I went to sleep kind of like, that didn't work. And then I had the idea by morning of like, oh, that's how I'm going to work the outside so that the inside makes this just like tidy little casing. I'm really excited for the other applications for this technique, but I'm going to try to stay on task right now and finish up showing you the rest of this casing. So after you've worked that around, I have something on my needles that I'm going to get ready for you to show you what happens with the inside of the casing and that stitch saver that is Lola's pickup line. Okay, I've worked the outside of the casing and now I am ready to work the inside of the casing. And you can see my stitch saver right here. And what I'm going to do with needle A, the smaller needle, is jam that right into the stitch saver and then carefully pull it through all of those stitches. What I find helps, especially if those stitches are a little bit tight, is to push the needle, not pull the stitch saver too much, because if you pull that stitch saver hard, it's just going to pull the stitch saver right off of the needle. So it helps to kind of push more than pull to get that through there. And you'll find that you probably have to do this in 2 or 3 sections to make it around the bag right there. So sometimes you have like this moment where you kind of got to jammy it around, and then we'll be able to do this last section right here, pulling that needle all the way through. And now, once you've done that, you can remove the stitch saver and you're going to go ahead and with needle A, you are going to knit around, but the first round you want to knit through the back loop to tighten up those stitches that you picked up so that that line is really, really tight. And then you'll go ahead and knit around for the number of rounds written in the pattern. I think it's 4 more rounds before you work the top of the bag where you knit those 2 layers of fabric together. And I want to show you how to do that next. So one little tip that I forgot to say is when you are done working the outside of your casing, when you kind of fold that layer, the front layer back that's on needle B, it can be very helpful to use end stoppers on the end of your needles so that your stitches don't come flying off. So put some end stoppers on there. And right now I'm all set up on my needles to show you joining those 2 layers together. This is my front layer right here on needle B. This is my back layer on needle A. I'm holding them parallel together, and then I'm using the working yarn from needle, sorry, I think I have a cat here in there. I'm going to get rid of that. I am holding needle B in front of needle A. I am using the working yarn from the inside layer that I just worked, and then I am going to use needle B to work those together. So I'm just taking that end stopper off and kind of bringing it around. And this section, there's always like a moment where you're like, what is happening here? And then it will come together. And I am going to knit 1 stitch from needle B together with 1 stitch from needle A, again using that working yarn. And I am going to knit that all the way around. And what that does is join the 2 layers together, making the casing. And I've been just really wanting to finish this bag, but I've had to leave it at this point for making the video so you could see the step, because I felt like it was one of those steps that you really needed to see me do. So tonight as soon as we're done, I'm going to be finishing this bling bag and then putting the I-cord through it. It's a fun little bag. Okay, so that is how you work Lola's two-timing technique. I think we'll be shooting a separate video for this at some point to talk about all the different applications. I'm a little bit obsessed, as you know, with Stitch Saver and the different things that it can do, and I'm happy to kind of add this to my arsenal of Stitch Saver techniques. So the last few things we should talk about with your bag is finishing your bag, other yarns you could use to make bling bag, a little bit about that peyote stitch bead for those of you who've never worked peyote stitch beading before. And so let's jump right into those last few things. Okay, when you have finished your bling bag, you're going to want to block it. I know it's just a bag, but your stitches will look so much neater after blocking. So just with some warm water, not hot or cold, soak your bag, lay it out to dry. If you don't want any kind of like fold lines, I let mine dry a little bit flat and wet, and then I actually hung it over a big mason jar. I turned the mason jar upside down and just kind of hung the bag with the bottom on the jar, and that worked really well for drying it in the round. And once it is dry, oh, I know what I didn't say. You can weave in all your ends before you block, but do not trim them. Wait to trim them until after your bag is dry. And if you are working with cotton yarn, you might want to use a little bit of drop of Eileen's Fabric Fusion to really like glue those ends so they don't worm their way out. Cotton yarn sometimes has the tendency to worm a little bit, so you'll want to use a little bit of droplet of this to just kind of lock them in place. It dries totally soft, don't worry about it. While your bag is blocking, you could go ahead and make your I-cord cord for cinching up your bling bag. You're going to want to use one strand of yarn, whether you're working with the fingering weight or DK weight yarn. You can either use an I-cord tool and quickly whip up a strap. You could use knitting needles, whatever. Either one, I'm not sure if you need to block it. You can decide looking at it when it's done if you want to block your I-cord or not. But once your bag is dry and your I-cord strap, sounds better than I-cord cord, you can just put a safety pin on the end of the I-cord and feed it through the casing of your bag. One of my testers had the forethought to make her I-cord early, and she embedded it into the casing before she joined the two layers together. That was really confusing to write into the pattern, so you could do that if you want to, but it also works. It's really easy to just put a safety pin on there, feed it all the way through, and then tie off the ends. If you want to, on that strap, you can have a slide bead, either any bead from your beading stash if you have a fun big bead, or you can make a peyote stitch bead, and I want to talk a little bit about those next. So a few years ago, I released a pattern called Pass the Peyote. I actually really want to bring those kits. I love that pattern. And Pass the Peyote had peyote stitch beads that were strung onto I-cord, and it's a sweet little cuff. So Pass the Peyote, I already have a video tutorial for making a peyote stitch bead, and it's an odd count peyote stitch bead. And I also have a photo tutorial for that. I will link to that blog post below that has both of the photo tutorial and the video tutorial in it. I think it's important for me to say that that video tutorial was made before I had my fancy studio and great equipment. So the education is exactly the same, but the quality might be a little bit different than you've become used to for Lola's Choice videos. One thing in that tutorial, I used some nylon thread, and now I like to use Fireline, which is this wire that is really easy to bead with, and it makes these really like nice tidy beads. And so you got Fireline in your kit and a Japanese beading needle, but you might find that your Fireline doesn't fit through the hole of your needle. And the trick for that is just to take your thumbnail or the back of a knife or something and kind of flatten the end of your Fireline so it's nice and flat. And then what you can do is hold your Fireline in between your fingers, and then it's pretty easy Watch, it's not going to work because you all are watching me do this. There we go. It's pretty easy to just fit that wire through the needle. So if you have a hard time, the trick is just to flatten the end of the wire a little bit. And then I've already got a Peyote stitch bead off and running. I wanted you to just see how fun and easy it is to work. The trick here as you are working the bead is to really pull up tightly. This is a 9 bead odd count peyote stitch bead. So you're going to start with 9 beads and then you'll just be working around for a total of 7 rows. And then you'll be, if you want to, you'll be sliding this onto your I-cord. Both strands of I-cord will fit through here. And that's just kind of the finishing touch to your bling bag. Again, you don't have to do it, but I love making, clearly love making these peyote stitch beads because I can't stop doing it right now. And it is time to talk to you about other yarns for making bling bag. So I think Bling Bag is a great blank canvas pattern for making basic sacks for your yarn balls, don't you? You could use fingering weight held double, you could use sport weight, you could use DK. This DK weight one that I'm working on right now is some Little Fox Yarns True Wash DK that I had left over from swatching. You really only need like 170 yards to make a bling bag, so you might find that you have yarns in stash. I could see someone doing some cool color work on the bottom. I could see you playing with that beading technique that I taught you to do your own motifs. If you have self-striping yarn, I think self-striping yarn would make an awesome bling bag. I have a skein downstairs in my stash that I'm already thinking of that would work really well. If you have scraps, you could do some helical striping. I think that would also be really interesting. So just like play around and share with me because I really want to see what you do with your bling bags. These are a great gift knit, and gift knitting season is coming. So thank you so much for watching. I really want to make sure that you ask questions if you have any. I am happy to help you. You can ask questions here. You can ask questions in the Ravelry group where I'll set up a thread, or in our Facebook group. I love knitting with you. I love sharing our creativity together. Show me your bling bags. I'm so excited to see them. Thank you so much and happy knitting.